Germany is suddenly talking about nuclear weapons, and not on the fringes, but at the very top of government. Chancellor Friedrich Merz has confirmed that Germany and key European allies have opened discussions on a joint nuclear deterrence. This is a major shift. For decades, Berlin has avoided even hinting at nuclear ambitions. But now a former German foreign minister from the anti-nuclear Green Party of all places says Europe may need its own atomic bomb because it can no longer rely solely on the United States. So what's happening behind the scenes? Is Europe preparing for a world where America steps back? Merz was asked directly about these calls for a European bomb. Before we bring in our expert, let's listen closely to how he answered and what he didn't say.
Was den atomaren Schutzschild betrifft, Deutschland hat sich in 2 international bindenden, völkerrechtlich bindenden Verträgen dazu verpflichtet, keine eigenen Atomwaffen zu haben. Das eine ist der 2+4-Vertrag, das zweite ist der Nichtverbreitungsvertrag über Atomwaffen, dem wir beigetreten sind. Insofern steht es nicht in unserem eigenen Ermessen und nicht in unserer eigenen Zuständigkeit, Atomwaffen in Deutschland zu haben, was aber nicht heißt, dass wir mit anderen Staaten Europas nicht auch über die gemeinsame atomare Abschreckung sprechen. Diese Gespräche werden geführt, aber das sind Gespräche, die ganz am Anfang sind und sie stehen auch nicht im Widerspruch zur atomaren Teilhabe mit den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika. Sie können eine Ergänzung darstellen, so wie das zum Beispiel zurzeit für Frankreich und für Großbritannien gilt. Aber noch einmal, diese Gespräche sind ganz am Anfang. Wir wissen, dass wir hier strategisch und auch militärpolitisch einige Entscheidungen treffen müssen, aber noch einmal, dafür ist die Zeit im Augenblick noch nicht reif. Wir führen strategische Gespräche über diese Frage mit den beteiligten Ländern.
Marina Henke is a professor at the Hertie School in Berlin and studies security issues. Professor Henke, you've written about Germany's new-old nuclear dilemma. What is that dilemma?
That on the one hand, Germany always wanted nuclear weapons and fully understands the power of having nuclear weapons, especially in a bargaining context, meaning in alliances when there's a huge dependence on the United States, that you have an outside option. But on the other hand, Germany, of course, signed a lot of treaty and its population is very hostile to nuclear weapons. So this is the dilemma. On the one hand, wanting them, but on the other hand, very much understanding that probably they will never get them.
How big a taboo are nuclear weapons in the German context? Could you sum that up for us?
In the 1950s, Germany realized that in a war between the United States and the Soviet Union, the battlefield would be West Germany. And so actually there was almost like a political consensus among Adenauer and his team that Germany somehow needs to get access to nuclear weapons. And access to nuclear weapons is something else than owning them, right? So they wanted to have some kind of sharing mechanism. And this is also what they implemented. So ever since then, Germany hosts American nuclear weapons on German soil. This is kind of like a famous nuclear sharing mechanism. And this mechanism has not changed. It is still present with us today. But of course, now with Trump and his rhetoric regarding Europe and regarding NATO, a lot of other possibilities are being put on the table on, like what else could substitute this nuclear sharing mechanism.
When you talk about nuclear sharing, you talk about Germany hosting American nuclear weapons. Do German armed forces maintain those weapons? Would they ever be involved in the deployment of those weapons? What exactly is meant by that?
So the sharing involves that the nuclear weapons are owned by the United States and still the US president needs to decide whether to use them. But actually the idea is that in a case of a crisis, they would be mounted on German fighter jets and these fighter jets would be flown by German pilots. So it's basically, it's a shared responsibility. The Germans cannot use them on their own. So the codes are with the Americans, but in case of use, very much German citizens, German soldiers would be involved.
And as you alluded to, the geopolitical situation around the world and the sounds and policy moves coming out of the White House have meant that Germany has engaged in a debate recently about potentially gaining access to nuclear weapons that aren't owned by the United States. What are the options on the table for Germany?
So the kind of, I would say, easiest version to implement is to establish a similar sharing mechanism with France. So when we talk about nuclear weapons, there are two types. We call them tactical nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear weapons. So strategic nuclear weapons, they can literally destroy an entire city. So they're very, very powerful. And then there's smaller versions of that, which are tactical nuclear weapons. Right now, only France has these types of tactical nuclear weapons. And these tactical nuclear weapons could, in theory, replace the American tactical nuclear weapons that are currently in Germany. And then, they could also, we need to have technical modifications and all of this, cannot be done on a day. But these French tactical nuclear weapons could also be mounted on German fighter jets and then be flown by German pilots, or Germany leases, borrows, buys French fighter jets, and then, German pilots would fly those French fighter jets. So this is a possibility that, just from a technological perspective, could be implemented fairly rapidly, if the political consensus, of course, and the political will is there, and this is kind of still a question mark. When it comes to British nuclear weapons, it's a little bit more tricky, because right now the UK only has strategic nuclear weapons, which are based on submarines, so they cannot be shared as easily. But Great Britain is in the process of also producing smaller tactical nuclear weapons. And once they're there, but this is still in the future, a similar mechanism could also be implemented with Great Britain.
But you haven't mentioned the one other option, which would be that Germany acquired its own nuclear weapons.
Today, in 2026, Germany probably still has the technological expertise to do that, because they're still nuclear scientists who could probably enrich fissile material to such a degree that a nuclear weapon could be produced. So until very recently, Germany had a civilian nuclear industry that has been abolished, but the process in the civilian industry are similar to those that you would use also for fissile grade material. You just need to enrich it more. And then Germany also has platforms, and platforms are missiles or some kind of other technologies, what you would use to produce out of the fissile material then a nuclear weapon. And also there, Germany does have these platforms, for example, the Taurus weapon. But what is very interesting, with the abolition of its civilian nuclear industry, and this ability of German scientists to enrich nuclear fissile material also, of course, is slowly vanishing. And so this is, there's a window, and, I'm speaking here as a scientist, not from a normative perspective, but there's a window of probably Germans currently still being able to do that, but in the future, they might no longer be able to do that. But just this technology of enriching fissile material is also present in a lot of other European countries. The Italians can do it, the Dutch can do it, the Swedes can do it. So it's not just something that is present in the UK and France, the official nuclear powers.
Is it something where within the establishment and in that network and in that in this network that people know would say, okay, Germany could, if it wanted to, and it began now, it could produce a nuclear weapon in X amount of years? Or is that something that's too difficult to really measure at this stage?
No, so, people who work in my field of research, they're fully aware of this. And, normally the timeline would be 3 to 5 years. But, the question is also, or even faster, actually, if you just wanted to have for symbolic purposes, right? So there's a lot of symbolism involved with nuclear weapons. For purely symbolic purposes, you can probably have one nuclear warhead in half a year if you really wanted it. Right? But, if we're really having an impact on the battlefield and being taken seriously by, mostly Russia, of course, one nuclear warhead is not enough. You need an entire arsenal. And so that, the strength comes with numbers. But the technological capability of producing, for example, one warhead, that would be fairly easy. All of this is very expensive, right? So Germany really needs to decide they want to do this. It needs to take priority. But, the technological capability is there.
One of the issues, or one of the options that I think is the most seriously discussed, is this idea of a joint nuclear deterrence. Friedrich Merz said that talks were underway with European partners. How does joint nuclear deterrence compare to nuclear sharing or extended deterrent? What do you understand by that?
So these days, nuclear deterrence is understood as always containing two parts. So there's the nuclear part, so deterring another nuclear actor, and in our case, that would be Russia, with nuclear weapons. And of course, currently they're just in the hands, in the NATO context, in the United States with the largest arsenal, and then in France and the UK. But, and that's the second leg of deterrence, that's conventional weapons. And you have now an array of conventional weapons, and Germany also has some of them, that can have a strategic mission. So what does this mean? So Russia has three types of nuclear weapons. So some of them are land-based in silos or in launchers. Some of them are submarine-based, and some of them are air-launched, so with bombers. And if you really want to deter Russia, you can also threaten that with conventional weapons, you can take out some of this infrastructure. Meaning, for example, you can use a long-range missile, the Taurus missile, and target nuclear weapon silos in Russia. Or some even say you can detect missile launchers. And if you take out this launching infrastructure, Russia can no longer use these weapons. And so this is why conventional weapons can also have a strategic mission and work alongside nuclear weapons in this deterrence context. And that's quite important. And this is also somewhat different to the Cold War, where this capability didn't exist to such a degree.
Is that because Germany now has the weapon systems, you mentioned the Taurus, in order to strike at the heart of the Russian nuclear program?
So it's not so much the program per se, it's the silos, right? Oh. So it's where they are stored. Exactly. And, in the 1980s and the 70s, these weapons, these missiles couldn't go as long, right? So it's kind of the range, and they were not as precise. So it is also about the precision that they can actually hit exactly one of the weak spots of these silos, because of course these silos are very hardened, but they have some weak spots, especially where you would open them. And by now this technology exists that you can have a long range, so very powerful conventional missile that is so precise that it can hit exactly that weak spot of a nuclear silo. And so at least this is in tests, right? So tests would say that they can test. Of course, it has never been tried in reality, obviously. Mm.
So how significant do you think those comments are from Friedrich Merz, that these talks are underway with European partners? Is this quite give us some context to that?
I think it's very real. I know that these talks are underway. Of course, no decisions have been made. But what I think everybody needs to understand, there is a kind of a real component to nuclear weapons, meaning, thinking through how they can be used in warfare. And then there is a very important political component to nuclear weapons. And so nuclear weapons are used a lot in a bargaining context. And as you know, Europe is in all sorts of domains quite unhappy with the United States. And if you want to signal to the United States, you know what, we can actually also go without you in the future. We no longer need you. We're not willing to accept your blackmail attempts. Then signaling we also no longer need to rely on the American nuclear umbrella can also be quite powerful. So there is a reality, and then there is a kind of a rhetorical component to conducting these conversations with France and the UK. So to speak, it's a signaling device to the United States. You're actually not as dependent on you as you might think. We have alternatives. We can substitute you, even in this nuclear domain where you think you're incredibly powerful.
What struck me yesterday listening to Friedrich Merz was he said, we have nuclear sharing with the United States, and these discussions would not replace that. They would be complementary. And I got the sense he's treading a very fine line. It's a delicate subject, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's incredibly delicate, right? So this is kind of like our last resort, also vis-a-vis Russia, right? I mean, nuclear weapons are incredibly powerful, and one could make an argument that the Cold War never escalated. And so, like that West Germany stayed free and democratic because of nuclear weapons. And, we have some pretty solid evidence that this was one of the reasons. And of course, this nuclear deterrence was provided mostly by the United States during the Cold War. And that's why, like a lot of Germans until today who understand the subject matter, they believe we should not give this up. So it's, it would be a very huge step for Germany to say we're willing to give up nuclear deterrence. That's literally the last resort. We would probably try to kind of, even if the United States would withdraw all sorts of troops and, kind of massively reduce its conventional support, we would probably somehow still hope that they would keep their nuclear umbrella over us. But still, there are, and I think this is logical and even useful, there are conversations of what Germany could do in case the United States would withdraw the nuclear umbrella.
Now, to wrap up, we've got these treaties that Germany signed up to, we've got public opinion, we've got huge costs. You've outlined the various options. What's your assessment, what's your expert thoughts on kind of, will Germany acquire a nuclear weapon in the next 10 to 20 years? What's your feeling?
No, I think it's very, very unlikely. But I do believe that these additional nuclear sharing mechanism, and I want to highlight addition and not substitutes, with France and with the UK, that might actually be a possibility. So that Germany then has a variety of sharing mechanism and doesn't entirely rely on the United States. I think this is quite plausible, but there's still, a huge gap between the sharing mechanism and Germany owning its own nuclear weapons.
Professor Marina Henke from the Hertie School, thank you very much for your time. That was really fascinating insights there.
My pleasure. Thank you.